Hello, you fucks. Welcome to John Solo's Beard Brigade. I'm John Solo. You are not, and I'm bouncing. I'm bouncing. God damn, I love this ball. I'm sitting on my ball right now. It's amazing. So, today we are working on Broken Chains Book 4, Wicked by EM Lindsey. Now, before you ask, no, that is not me on the cover with hair or anything like that. I don't have tattoos like that. What are you fucking thinking? We did not narrate the first 3 books in the series,
Pain us.
but we are taking it over. Now, we've jumped into the middle of it. The author does suggest that you listen or read the other 3 first. I don't know that it's absolutely essential, but it sure as fuck it helps, so I would recommend it. Everybody's an E.M. Lindsey fan, so I'm sure you've already probably listened to or read this. But anyways, let me go over this. I'm going to read you the summary so you know what the hell's going on. Come on, tiger, claw me up. Hawk doesn't talk about his past, and it's not because he has a stutter that rarely lets him speak more than 3 words at a time. The shadows of what was haunting his every waking hour. No, the shadows of what was haunt his every waking hour. I'm a professional. But the Broken Chains MC have been a sanctuary he never expected. And Hawk is the sort of man who knows better than to cross lines, especially when it comes to the safety of his brothers. But when Jax, the VP of the Cobras, looks at him like he's a whole man instead of shattered pieces of the person he was before he left his home behind, he can't help but want to be just a little bit wicked. See? See how she played that name in there? Broken Chains MC is a motorcycle club romance series best read in order. It contains dubious morality, mild violence, and happily ever afters. And large cocks. I added that last bit myself. So, we are working on, we're going to be finished with this today, I think. Probably be posting it up tomorrow. But we are on chapter 11. We're about halfway through the story. This is a bit later than we normally do this sort of thing for a story time. But I just ran into like the perfect scene. There's really no spoilers in it, I don't think. But it's the 2 of them, and one of them's about to give the other a tattoo. And I think it's freaking hot. Hope you enjoy. Have fun. See you later. Oh, and wish Tracy a happy vacation. Today is the 22nd of July, 2022, and she is about to leave, and she's going to be gone for a week. So everybody say, bye, Tracy. Be safe. My life's going to suck for a week. 11. Jax felt uneasy about leaving the shop. It was absurd, considering Hawk was an enforcer, and in spite of his slight body, he was obviously capable of taking care of himself. Hell, more than that. Jax knew if he ever posed a threat, Hawk would take him out without breaking a sweat or batting an eye. That shouldn't have turned him on, but he couldn't help it. Of course, he'd been half-hard all damn day, and it had only gotten worse as he had watched Hawk draw. He got lost easily in it, his pencil flying over the page, the look of concentration on his face. Worse, as he had watched Hawk draw, he got lost easily in it. Worse, as he had watched Hawk draw, he got lost easily in it, his pencil flying over the page, a look of concentration on his face. And he was good. He was more than good. The emotion in the art he had up on the walls made Jax's chest go tight in a way very little else did. The idea that he'd be coming back to the shop to let Hawk ink him was almost too much to handle. He was grateful Hawk had ordered him to pick up food because he wasn't sure he would have been able to sit the shop to let Hawk ink him was almost too much to handle. He was grateful Hawk had ordered him to pick up food because he wasn't sure he would have been able to sit still for him without a reprieve. He was still shaken from the crash and spending 3 days drugged. He was amazed he was up on his feet, but he'd also survived a lot worse. He'd been shot more than once, a couple times damn near fatally. He'd wrecked his bike enough times a road rash was an old friend. He wasn't sure he had a bone in his body that hadn't been cracked at least once. But losing time, that fucker getting the jump on him, that was throwing him more than anything. His conversation with his old man hadn't gone well that morning. Reaver was more pissed that Jax hadn't anything. His conversation with his old man hadn't gone well that morning. Reaver was more pissed that Jax wasn't heading back to Savannah because they had another missing shipment, and he wanted Jax to roll out to see what was going on. But, with a busted bike and battered face, Jax wouldn't be any good to the Cobras, and it had been obvious from Reaver's tone, Jax was on his last leg. He didn't think it was going to be a big, dramatic exit, though. His brother had been let go with little fanfare. Blaze had shucked his cut and tipped his old man a wave. No one had said anything as he'd left the bar, and then life had just carried on as normal. Jax wasn't fooling enough as he'd left the bar, and then life had just carried on as normal. Holy shit, did someone punch her? What happened to her tooth? As he'd left the bar, and then life had just carried on as normal. Jax wasn't foolish enough to think people wouldn't protest about him leaving, though, considering he was the club's VP, and he half wondered if a couple of guys, Tech in particular, would follow him out. Reaver wouldn't take that shit lightly, and there might be a riot in that case, but Jax was pretty damn sure he was willing to take the risk. Besides, there were too many men willing to step up and take his place, and it wasn't like Reaver held any parental affection toward him. Hell, it wasn't like Jax wanted him to. Lost in his thoughts, it took Jax a while to reorient himself in town and get back on task, but eventually he found a little burrito place tucked on the corner of a street near the boardwalk. It was nestled in with a handful of other shops, and there was a line out the door, but he didn't mind the wait. The longer he took, the more time he had to collect himself before he let Hawk get his hands all over him and mark him up. He ignored most of the stares from the people dressed in beach gear, and he heard a couple of bikes rumble by as they took the coastal drive toward Daytona. He was on high alert, and he knew he stuck out like a sore thumb with his face all bashed up, even without his cut. His fingers twitched, reaching for his piece, but he remembered almost too late that he'd lost it in the crash. He'd been so upside down he'd forgotten to ask Hawk what the hell had happened to it. He felt more off-kilter than he'd ever been, his breath catching in his throat when a group of bikers rode by. They weren't flying colors, though, just surf-themed T-shirts and lean-back on cruisers, old rich white men with nothing better to do on a weekday afternoon. He breathed a little easier after that, though he realized he was still jumpy as he moved through the line and into the shop to order a bunch of crap to keep them sated for the rest of the day. His arms were heavy with 2 paper bags when he finally had all his shit, and he wondered, when it came to Hawk, if he was being too fucking obvious. He didn't know how to deal with emotions like this, a want that felt like a need. It made him crave violence, because the one thing he couldn't take was feeling out of control. Jax managed to get a hold of himself, though, and when he pulled up to the shop, his stomach only sank a little when he saw a new car parked out front. It was some little electric piece of shit, and it went perfectly with the kid who was signing a form at the front counter when he pushed through the doors. Jax raised his brows at Hawk, who waved him through the little swinging door. "This won't take long. Hour tops. You should eat." Aw. You know, really, that could have been odd. Like, you look identical. "Take long. Hour tops. You should eat." Jax nodded, then looked over his shoulder at the guy who was staring a little wide-eyed and too curiously. He offered him a grimace, and he flushed, hurriedly going back to the paper, and he heard Hawk's little scoff of amusement as he made his way to the back stall and began to unpack the bags. It felt weird eating alone, and Jax couldn't exactly keep conversation with Hawk, considering he'd need both hands, and one of them was strapped to his chest anyway. So he pulled a rolling chair into the middle of the room just as Hawk was settling the kid in the chair, and he jerked a nod at him when he grabbed Hawk's attention. "Can I help?" When Hawk's face fell into an annoyed scowl. See, that's in single quotes.
Yeah, that's Jack's signing.
Yeah. You lied to me. He
I
jerked a nod
said
at him when he
single quotes when signing. I didn't say they were
the
separate.
kid in the chair. Okay, well, and he jerked a nod at him when he grabbed Hawk's attention. Like Congress, I gotta make sure I know your real meaning. The kid in the chair, and he jerked a nod at him when he grabbed Hawk's attention. "Can I help?" When Hawk's face fell into an annoyed scowl, Jax rolled his eyes. "Your arms hurt." After a beat, the other man nodded. "Yeah. You ever worked in a shop?" Jax shook his head. "No, but I've spent time enough in a chair." Hawk considered him, then looked back
Spent
at
enough time in a chair.
You ever worked in a shop? Jax shook his head. No, but I've spent enough time in a chair. Hawk considered him, then looked back at the kid who was unabashedly staring, then nodded. Ink cups are on the counter, and I just need black and white bottles from my toolbox. Wear gloves. Jax fought the urge to flip him off for reminding him of something so fucking basic, but he also kind of wanted to kiss him for it, because everything Hawk did made Jax want to kiss him. Instead of either of those things, he brushed past the other man and walked up to the little toolbox tucked in the corner of the stall. This your first tattoo? He asked. Box tucked in the corner of the stall. This your first tattoo? He asked. The kid made a small, startled sound. Oh, I didn't think you... Well, I mean... He licked his lips and shrugged. No, but the other one I have is a really small moon. Jax looked over his shoulder and raised a brow. Why'd you come here? No offense, kid, but this don't seem like your scene. The kid flushed even harder, turning so red Jax had to wonder if he was lightheaded. Someone said this place was... You know. He looked petrified for a minute, then he gestured toward the front. It took Jax a second, but then he saw what the kid was talking about. There was a rainbow flag in the window. It was small and unobtrusive, but it was also there for anyone to see. Friendly? Yeah, he said with a small grunt. Makes sense. The kid realized as Jax pulled black gloves over his hands and squeezed dots of jelly onto the tray.
Kid, relax.
Yeah, he said with a small grunt. Makes sense. The kid relaxed as Jax pulled black gloves over his hands and squeezed dots of jelly onto the tray. He settled the cups down in each dot, 3 of them, next to the blue and pink Hawk had already filled. Not sure if it was enough. He hoped it was a good guess, but he'd never seen Hawk work. Though he was going to get his chance now, and he hoped he didn't get a full boner until he was sitting somewhere he could hide it. You're in luck, Jack said after he lined up the ink bottles and stripped off his gloves and tossed them in the bin. Hawk's work is some of the best. The kid cleared his throat again. Maybe it was a nervous habit, but it was really fucking annoying. Yeah, I saw some of it online. He doesn't have a website, but there are a bunch of people who post his work, and, He trailed off and shrugged. I didn't think he'd take me. Slow afternoon, Jax grunted. Hawks, yeah. Rhymes with cocks. He'd take me. Slow afternoon, Jax grunted. Hawk came back around the corner, holding the paper with the stencil on it, and Jax moved out of the way, dropping back down to his chair. Hawk looked at the little display, then over at Jax, and gave him a nod of approval. It was ridiculous how that went straight to his dick, and he glanced down to see if his erection was obvious from where he was sitting. When he looked back up again, Hawk was carefully adding drops of water to a couple of the small ink cups filled with black. He worked meticulously and carefully, his thin fingers moving in an intricate dance as he applied a spray, then pressed the stencil to the kid's arm. When he peeled it away, Jax could see it was an American traditional sparrow, with a flower in its claws. He tried to imagine what it would look like when it was done, but his brain came up blank. The kind... He tried to imagine what it would look like when it was done, but his brain came up blank. He kind of liked that about the moment. How it would all be a big reveal. It was like peeling more and more layers away from a Hawk, and Jax's heart thudded harder in his chest. He tried to keep his gaze focused, but it was impossible not to look at the other man. He was like a beacon, a magnet. He glowed in his simplicity and silence, and Jax swore he could sit there for the rest of his life just like that, and never tire of watching him. He startled when Hawk glanced over again, his face going pink, and he wondered if Hawk would make him pay for it later. Some of that must have shown on his face, because Hawk's lip turned up in the smallest smirk, and he turned back to the kid and lifted his gloved hand. First and middle finger.
As he turned back to the kid.
His face going pink, and he wondered if Hawk would make him pay for it later. Some of them must have shown on his face, because Hawk's lip turned up in the smallest smirk as he turned back to the kid and lifted his gloved hand, first and middle fingers twisted around each other in an R. Ready. The kid blinked and Jax cleared his throat. That means ready. He's asking you, he clarified. Oh, yep. The kid's gaze darted over to Jax for only a second. Then he leaned back and took another breath. I'm ready. Hawk nodded, then the sound of his machine filled the room, and Jax settled in to watch the man work. I can see you, Brooke. We got cameras. See, the biggest difference between 2018 and now is the randomness of it. When I was reading the books before, I always had the same pattern. Every time when I read a line, it would always sound like that. Every single time. Whereas now, if I'm going to read a line, not only do I go quicker, but also I kind of tend to put a little randomness in it. Like I'm really talking, you know what I mean? Total fucking game changer difference. Thank you, Sean Allen Pratt.
That is precisely why I did not gravitate toward your stuff a few years ago.
I don't blame you one bit, dude.
But I have definitely, you are in the top favorite now.
It is, like, and it can be trained. Sean taught me, and it absolutely can be trained. But it had to be pointed out. It's not that hard, but it had to be pointed out of, hey, you're doing this. You need to do this. And it's just, that draws interest in. People have to pay attention at that point because it's not always in the same pattern. It's hard to describe, I guess. I should think
totally
about that
get
point
it.
more. Yeah, I should think about how to explain that point more. I haven't thought about that in a long time. Remind me to think about that on, like, I don't know, the
Okay.
32nd of the month. Settled in to watch the man work. I think Tracy is packing, Cher. You are correct. Settled in to watch the man work. Jack swore 100 hours had passed, not just 45 minutes, before the kid was paid up and out of the shop. He said nothing as he watched Hawk pocket the money, but his mouth was dry after having watched him work so fucking efficiently and competently. He had no idea that was a kink of his, but now, Jesus, he wasn't sure he'd be able to get through an entire tattoo of his own. Hawk's hands holding him down and making him bleed without blowing his load. That shit might be nasty. Him down and making him bleed without blowing his load. This shit might be nasty now, Jack said, shaking himself out of his thoughts. He jutted his chin at the spread he'd laid out on the counter, only just remembering that Hawk hadn't eaten yet. But it's a burrito, so it'll probably hold up. Hawk offered him a crooked smile as he washed his hands. Then he swiped them over his jeans before seizing one of the bags and sinking into a chair with a groan as he pulled the burrito out and peeled back the foil. Jax hadn't really watched the guy eat before, but he noticed his mouth moved kind of slow, his tendons sticking out a little as he chewed. Is that? He started, then stopped. Hawk pinned him with a stare, then raised a brow, his face asking him to finish his thought. It's like hard for you to eat that shit, isn't it? Hawk pinned him with a stare, then raised a brow, his face asking him to finish his thought. It's like hard for you to eat that shit, isn't it? Hawk's cheeks turned faintly one more time with feeling. Hawk pinned him with a stare, then raised a brow, his face asking him to finish his thought. It's like hard for you to eat that shit, isn't it? Hawk's cheeks turned faintly pink, and he shrugged, setting the burrito down on his thigh. I'm used to it. Jax kind of figured, but he hated the fucking world where a man like Hawk would have to get used to struggling through meals because someone had beat the fuck out of him when he was a kid. And it was obvious he wasn't going to heal any more than he was now, which meant he'd struggle like that for the rest of his life. like that for the rest of his life. Sorry, I didn't mean to pry. Hawk waved him off, then went back to eating, and they settled into a comfortable silence. Jax's ears were still buzzing a little from the sound of the machine, but it was finally fading into the background. He finished the rest of his own food, not as good now that it had buzzing a little from the sound of the machine, but it was finally fading into the background. Buzzing a little from the sound of the machine, but it was finally fading into the background. He finished the rest of his own food, not as good now that it had cooled a little, but it was enough to settle his nerves as he prepared for what was coming next. He glanced up at Hawk a little, but it was enough to settle his nerves as he prepared for what was coming next. He glanced up as Hawk balled the foil from his burrito and tossed it into the basket. Are you sure about the moth? Jax didn't need him to clarify. I'm sure. There's no fucking world where I wouldn't want your work on my body. Hawk stared at him another long moment. Then he gave a single nod and pushed to his feet. Jax didn't move, instead watching him as he pulled the hawk moth drawing from the wall and held it up against the light. The paper was thin enough to see through, cut only through the sharp black lines of the pencil Hawk had used, and Jax could almost feel the ghost of it etching into his skin. Fuck, he was desperate. After a beat, Hawk pointed to the chair, then strolled out of the room, and Jax didn't bother hesitating. He wanted to smoke, what he figured Hawk was doing, but he knew if he went out there, they'd get derailed. He managed to keep his hands off the enforcer all afternoon, but his patience was wearing thin. His boots clicked on the hard floor as he moved into Hawk's stall, and he kicked his feet up. He was far from relaxed, but he'd managed to regulate his breathing by the time Hawk came back in. The thick whiff of cigarette smoke was enough to confirm what Hawk had been up to, and Jax felt the craving for one creeping up his spine. But he'd wait. He had to wait. How do you want me? He asked when Hawk approached him. Hawk's eyes went heavy-lidded, and he dragged his tongue over his bottom lip before leaning close. For a wild, reckless second, Jax thought he was coming in for a kiss. Then he bent low enough his forehead brushed against his bicep, and the chair started to tilt back until he was almost entirely flat. Blood pooled in his groin, and he breathed a steady sigh as the enforcer pulled back. Hawk met his gaze with a question on his face, and Jax just nodded, because the answer to anything the man wanted to know was yes. It would be yes for as long as Jax was around. Their gazes held for a beat. Then Jax closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the other man prepping his station. Is that code for... Closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the other man prepping his station. There was no stencil, and Jax's heart threatened to beat out of his chest when he realized Hawk was going freehand. Not just a mark on his skin. His mark, his design. A piece of Hawk he could keep for the rest of his life. He jolted when gloved fingers touched him, and he cracked open his eye to see that Hawk had removed his sling and was using his injured arm to spritz rubbing alcohol over his throat. You shouldn't take that off, Tiger. Sling and was using his injured arm to spritz rubbing alcohol over his throat. You shouldn't take that off, Tiger. Hawk rolled his eyes. I'm fine. Jax wanted to argue with him more, but he knew it was pointless. He had seen fire and determination like that on more than one person's face in the long, long years he had been with the Cobras. Half the time it led to reckless decisions that left them dead and buried, but the other half of the time, it saved their lives. With Hawk, he knew it was the latter. He knew the man would never go down easy. A firm thumb tilted his chin back, and he felt the swipe of a razor, clearing away what little hair he had left. It was sharp and uncomfortable, but he knew it would be nothing compared to the pain coming, and God, he was ready for it. He wanted to feel the sharp, deep burn on the surface of his skin, and then later, he wanted to feel it inside him, stretching him wide as Hawk took him without a single care about how it made him feel. He wanted to be split open, sewn back up, then ripped apart again, and he didn't think he'd have to beg for it. Time seemed to slow once Hawk started drawing on his throat, and then he felt a swipe of jelly on him before the man leaned in close. Jax got a whiff of his breath, all pungent tobacco and leftover cilantro, and he fought the urge to lift his head and steal a kiss. But there would be time enough for that later. Ready? Jax swallowed thickly, then nodded. Hit me, Tiger. Hawk made a soft noise, and he reached out, tilting Jax's head as far back as it could go in the chair. Instead of letting go right away, though, he dragged his gloved thumb over Jax's bottom lip, then over his jaw, then down the front of his Adam's apple. Hold, he said slowly. You're He took a breath, and Jax wanted to reach inside his head to understand him, just so he didn't have to struggle. Chin, he forced out. Up and tight. Jax played with the position of his chin until Hawk made a noise of satisfaction. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was going to cause an ache in his jaw, but he didn't give a fuck when Hawk...
It wasn't comfortable.
Well, it wasn't uncomfortable. Oh, that's the opposite. You're onto something. Do you do this all the time? Tight. Jax played with the position of his chin until Hawk made a noise of satisfaction. It wasn't comfortable. It was going to cause an ache in his jaw, but he didn't give a fuck when Hawk rubbed on another swipe of jelly, then fired up the machine. The vibration of the needles went right through him, and the first drag was exquisite fire. It was going to be hell on earth sitting for him like that. But God, he had never wanted to linger for eternity so much in his life. That would be our story time.